That day, I don't know if it was fate or just a coincidence, but both Noah and I got to go home early. Our parents were still at work and the house was empty, just the two of us in the quiet, spacious home. Only our footsteps echoed on the wooden floor as we walked inside. Noah followed right behind me, still in his school uniform. We were both exhausted, not just from the long day, but from something invisible weighing down on us. As soon as we stepped into the kitchen, the sight before us made us pause. The table hadn't been cleared since morning. The dishes were still there, untouched. A few chopsticks had fallen to the floor. The glass cup my mother always used was still sitting next to the sink, the dried streaks of orange juice clinging to its sides. Noah and I exchanged glances. Then we sighed almost at the same time. Neither of us spoke. We just quietly started cleaning up. I picked up each bowl and stacked them neatly in the sink. Noah stood beside me, collecting the chopsticks and spoons, wiping the table. Everything happened like a habit, like the many times we had done housework together before. We continued cleaning, but this time there was no silence. Small stories were naturally brought up. Noah told me about a classmate who got caught sleeping during a test. I told him about a stray cat I had fed in front of the school gate. Just like that, the tension between us seemed to ease. For a moment it felt like before, like the distance between us had never existed. Sometimes Noah would intentionally drop a chopstick or pretend to spill water just to tease me. I glared at him, but then I laughed. Realizing he was just trying to lighten the mood, the table gradually became tidy. The dishes were neatly stacked in the sink. Only one bowl remained, standing alone in the middle of the table. Noah and I both reached for it at the same time. I was a little quicker. My fingers brushed the bowl first. But then I felt another hand on top of mine. Noah had reached for it too, just a moment too late. It was only a few seconds, but time seemed to slow down. I could feel the warmth of his hand, the lines of his long, slender fingers stronger than mine. A strange feeling passed through me, a feeling I couldn't name. Noah froze as if he had sensed something too. We both looked up. Our eyes met. And in that moment I saw myself reflected in his gaze, an unconcealed confusion. We laughed, but it wasn't the same natural laughter from before. Something was wrong. We both knew it. But neither of us said anything. Noah was the first to pull away. He withdrew his hand quickly, as if afraid that leaving it there any longer would expose something neither of us were ready to confront. I let go of the bowl too, but in my flustered state, it tilted slightly, nearly slipping off the table. Caught it just in time. But my palms had become sweaty. Before I knew it, silence had fallen between us again. Noah turned away, moving quickly to the other side of the kitchen. "I'll go find a broom," he mumbled, his voice low, almost uncertain. Without waiting for me to respond, he left. I stood there, my hand still resting on the bowl, the feeling of his touch still lingering on my skin. Outside the window, the sky had turned a pale shade of orange as the sun began to set. Inside the kitchen there was only me, and an unnamed silence. I forced myself to focus. I continued gathering the dishes, bringing them to the sink. Noah didn't say anything when he returned. He just quietly grabbed a towel and began wiping the table, finishing up where we had left off. Everything went back to normal. At least that's what it looked like on the surface. The water flowed steadily as I scrubbed each plate, each cup. The soap suds clung to my sleeves, forming a layer of white bubbles. I was so focused that I forgot Noah was still in the kitchen. I didn't even notice when he finished cleaning. I didn't realize he was standing behind me, until his voice broke the silence. "Move over a bit." Startled, I turned. Noah was right next to me. Without thinking, I stepped aside, making room. He didn't say anything else. He just rolled up his sleeves, turned on the faucet beside me, and started washing the dishes with me. The feeling of standing next to Noah at the sink made me a little uncomfortable. The space suddenly felt smaller, even though the kitchen was just as spacious as always. I could feel the warmth from his arm, see the drops of water splashing onto his sleeve as he washed the dishes. Everything was normal. We didn't say anything, just focused on our task. Occasionally, my hand would lightly brush against his when we both reached for a bowl or a plate, but we pretended it didn't happen. Then it happened. A bowl slipped from my fingers. It fell fast, hurtling toward the ground. Instinctively, Noah reached out to catch it. But instead of the bowl, his hand caught something else. Me. More specifically, his hand squeezed my thigh. I froze. A strange electric current shot down my spine, making every nerve in my body tense. I couldn't tell what it was, shock, confusion, or something more complicated. My breath hitched. For a few seconds he was motionless too. I could feel it. His hand still pressed against my skin through the thin fabric. The warmth from his palm spread, burning. Time seemed to stop. I wanted to step back. To say something. To break this unbearable silence. But my throat tightened. Everything had happened too fast. Too suddenly. Then Noah pulled his hand away as if burned. But the look in his eyes when he met mine, it was different. It wasn't the familiar look I had always known. It was darker. Deeper. And there was something in that gaze that made me afraid to look too long. The bowl crashed to the floor, shattering. But neither of us cared. I knew, the moment his hand touched me, an invisible boundary had been erased. I didn't know what that meant. I only knew that from this moment on between us, things would never be the same. The small kitchen was silent. A suffocating silence. I could hear my own breathing. Each beat disordered and out of control. The air felt heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. The warmth of his hand still lingered on my thigh, burning. I should have dismissed it as an accident. A reflex. Something meaningless. But I couldn't. Because his eyes said it all. The shattered pieces of porcelain lay scattered at our feet, but neither of us moved. I stood there frozen, not knowing what to do. I wanted to believe this was just a fleeting moment, that if I turned away now, everything would return to normal. But I couldn't walk away. And Noah didn't leave. The space between us felt unbearably close. So close I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. I didn't dare meet his eyes, because I knew if I looked too long I would see something I shouldn't see. Something raw. Something unsuppressed. His gaze flickered. Then suddenly, he bent down to pick up the broken shards on the floor, as if trying to distract himself from whatever had just passed between us. I took a step back, trying to create distance. But when I placed the last dish in the sink, I realized. My hands were shaking. Why am I like this? We had touched before. But this wasn't the same. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't just a reflex. It left something behind, something too obvious to ignore. I bit my lip, trying to focus on the sound of the water running in the sink. Trying to pretend nothing had happened. If I just ignored it, if I just didn't say anything, maybe everything would go back to normal. But then Noah's voice broke the silence. Emily. I froze. Have you ever thought about going further? My heart stopped. For a moment, the world around me faded into a dull hum. I stood still, my hands gripping the edge of the sink, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't know how to react. I knew exactly what he meant. Beyond the limit. Those words echoed in my mind, drilling into every corner of my thoughts. I wanted to believe he was joking. I wanted to believe it was just a random, meaningless question. But his voice, it was too serious, too sincere. Part of me wanted to deny it immediately. Wanted to turn back, laugh it off, say, "What are you thinking? Stop talking nonsense." But I didn't. Because the moment the question left his lips, I wavered. Something stirred inside me. Something both foreign and familiar. A feeling I couldn't name. Fear. Curiosity. Denial. But not complete rejection. I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. The silence stretched between us. And I could feel his eyes on me. Waiting. An answer. I needed to say something. But I could only stand there, frozen, struggling with myself. If I refused outright, would he be hurt? Would he stop caring about me? If I responded, would I be opening a door that I shouldn't? I wasn't sure. I had never been sure about this. But I knew one thing. If I said the wrong thing, we would end up in a place neither of us could escape from. The air in the kitchen felt suffocating. A thin string stretched between us, fragile, waiting for the slightest movement to snap. And then he spoke first. "Sorry. I was just kidding." I looked up at him. The smile on his lips seemed natural. But in his eyes there was something else. Something sad. I didn't know if he was really joking. I didn't know if he regretted asking that question. But I knew that the moment those two words left his mouth, "Just kidding," an invisible distance appeared between us. He turned away, walking out of the kitchen. I didn't stop him. I just stood there watching his back disappear. And my heart felt strangely empty. We hadn't crossed that line. But at that moment we weren't the same anymore. That night I was in my room lying in bed staring at the dark ceiling, trying to shake this feeling. But it was useless. The question kept repeating in my mind. Have you ever thought about going further? It echoed over and over like a song stuck in an endless loop. I closed my eyes, opened them again, turned over, hugged my pillow. Still no peace. I pulled the covers up, sat up, then lay back down. But my mind wouldn't stop. I wasn't just thinking about the question. I was thinking about the look in his eyes when he asked it. Not a joke. Not casual. Serious. Sincere. Expectant. What had he been expecting? A nod? A rejection? Some sign that we were thinking the same thing? I didn't know. But I knew one thing: I couldn't keep avoiding this. I sat up. The room was dark, the only light coming in through the window. I looked down at my hands clenched into the sheets, trying to contain an emotion I couldn't name. I couldn't just lie here forever, battling my thoughts. I needed answers. And I knew there was only one person who could give them to me. I took a deep breath. Quietly I got out of bed. My steps were so light they barely made a sound. I stood in front of my door for a moment, as if asking myself one last time, should I do this? Then I opened it and walked out. The hallway was dark, quiet. I walked to Noah's door, stood there, my heart pounding. I didn't know how long I waited before I finally knocked. The door opened almost immediately. He hadn't been asleep. In the dim light from his room, I could see the surprise in his eyes when he saw me. I opened my mouth, but my voice was barely a whisper. I have something to tell you. His gaze flickered. For a second he hesitated. Then without a word he stepped aside, opening the door for me. I walked in. The door clicked shut behind me. And in that moment I knew. Every boundary between us had disappeared. The room was dim. The only light filtering through the window, casting soft shadows on the walls. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding, steady, relentless. He stood in front of me. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We both knew. This was a moment of no return. Right now I could still turn back. I could still say that I just came to talk. I could still pretend I didn't understand what was happening. But I didn't. I stood there, looking at him, accepting. The air between us changed. A change I could no longer stop. And then, he reached out. His fingers brushed against my skin, light, hesitant. But even that faint touch was enough. Enough to shatter every wall I had built up until now. There was no distance. No boundary. No turning back. That night we crossed the line. And I knew. From the moment I stepped into this room, there was no going back. Morning came. No words were spoken. I quietly got out of bed, put my clothes back on, walked to the door. My hand rested on the doorknob, but I didn't turn it. Not yet. I looked back. He was still lying there watching me. His eyes held so many emotions I couldn't name. I wanted to ask, do you regret it? Did this mean anything to you? But I couldn't say a word. I just smiled. A small fleeting smile. Then I turned the knob and walked out. The door closed behind me. But there was no peace in my heart. I returned to my room, sat down on my bed, pulled the blanket over me. But the emptiness remained. Had I done the right thing? Had I made a mistake? I didn't know. But I knew. Something inside me was broken. And I wasn't sure if I could ever fix it. After that night, we were never the same. The conversations became fewer. The moments we spent together felt like fleeting shadows of the past. When we crossed paths in the hallway, we only exchanged small nods before walking in opposite directions. No more warm smiles. No more casual jokes. Only silence. An unspoken distance neither of us dared to close. I asked myself over and over, if I hadn't knocked on his door that night, would things have been different? If I hadn't let my emotions lead me, could we have stayed the same? But I knew there were no answers to what-ifs. The past couldn't be changed. And I had to accept that I had made a mistake. More than anyone, I was the one who had to bear the consequences. Days passed. Neither of us spoke about that night. Not out of anger. Not out of hatred. But because we both knew. Once a line is crossed, some things can never be undone. Not long after, Noah told our parents he wanted to move to another city for school. He said he wanted new opportunities, a fresh start. They believed him. They were proud of him. But I knew the truth. He left because he couldn't stand being here. And I didn't blame him. The day he packed his bags, I stood at the doorway wanting to say something. But the words wouldn't come. For the first time in a long time, he spoke first. Take care of yourself. For simple words. But they felt like a lifetime apart. I clenched my fists. Wanted to stop him. Wanted to say sorry. But I knew no apology could change what had happened. So I just nodded. And watched as he walked away. That day I realized, there are mistakes that cannot be undone. There are things that once lost can never be retrieved. And there is no if in this world. All I could do was move forward. And carry the weight of my own choices. I could only move forward, carrying the wound I inflicted upon myself. I share this story not in search of comfort or forgiveness, but as a reminder to those standing on a fragile line, never let yourself go too far. There are mistakes that once made leave no path for return. There are feelings that once crossed beyond a certain point will never be as pure as before. There are cracks that no matter how much you try to mend them, can never be restored to their original state. If you ever find yourself hesitating, stop and think carefully. A single moment of weakness can cost you the most precious things in your life. And if you have made a mistake, learn to face it, accept the consequences, and grow from it. Mistakes do not define you, but how you confront them will shape the person you become.